Welcome everybody to the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre. I'm Sally Warhaft and it's a pleasure to see you all on this, well, slightly balmy evening. Joining us this evening is, a Gold Walkley award-winning, Logie award-winning. I don't think we've had that double as a single guest on the Fifth Estate before. I think Ray Martin might be one of the very few to have pulled that off.
Yes, that rings a bell.
Does that ring a bell?
He might have been the competition.
I think so. Philip Chubb will be perhaps best known to you all because of those awards and the documentary Labour in Power, which of course tracked another Labour era. And he has written a new book, a book that I really, really wanted to read, that I wanted to be written, so thank you very much, about what happened to Australia's climate change policy. Anyway, before I get into it, please give Philip Chubb another very warm Wheeler welcome. It is an incredible story, how you can come into office as the first government voted in with climate change perhaps as the central policy, with the broad support of the electorate, with a very, very popular Prime Minister and for a time, support of an opposition leader in Malcolm Turnbull after Brendan Nelson fell. But it all fell apart, and I'm sure lots of people like me wondered how on earth that happened. Philip, you've written the story, and boy, is it a sorry tale. To start off, has there ever been a policy collapse equivalent to this?
Well, certainly not in the modern era. I think that, some people in response to that question might think back to bank nationalisation, for example, in the late 1940s, and earlier than that, no doubt there were humiliations, but in a period when chaos reigned in the parliament before the two-party system formed completely. But if you think back in the last 30 to 40 years, you would say that this was the greatest humiliation.
So tell us at what point in the beginning of the sort of collapse of this, what was the first thing that went wrong?
Yes. I think the trajectory to failure was established very early, and that was when Rudd's tendency to centralise control, what's sometimes called his command and control leadership style, came to the fore, and for a variety of not very good reasons, he effectively abolished Cabinet's Climate Change Subcommittee. In a fit of pique, relatively early in 2008, he threw out of the room, when that subcommittee was meeting, several senior public service heads, several cabinet ministers, and what that meant was that the so-called troika, as they were described, which was a group involving Rudd, Penny Wong, and to a lesser extent Wayne Swan, whose attention was diverted to other important issues.
Like the global financial crisis.
Like that, but the economy in general. Were left in virtually sole control of climate change policy development and the political strategy associated with it. And so that had a couple of really serious consequences. It meant that some of the wiser heads in Cabinet weren't brought into the policy-making process, and undoubtedly mistakes were made because the people making the policy didn't have sufficient inputs. The advice wasn't as good as it could have been. but much more importantly, the entire cabinet was not available to them to go out and sell the policy. So we say there was no narrative constructed to enable Australians or provide Australians with a framework in which they could understand the need for carbon pricing in the context of climate change action. So no narrative created to enable them to understand why, for example, they may need to pay a bit more for electricity, that there could be cost of living implications. Australian voters never understood that. And part of the reason they didn't was because power was concentrated in such a small group, in Penny Wong's case very inexperienced and very technocratic, that it was just simply, there was no mechanism to communicate appropriately.
It's an interesting lesson for the government of today and for all future governments, but you think about right now what the current federal government is trying, the message it's trying to get out about the budget, about an economic crisis, and the need to carry people along. If Kevin Rudd couldn't do it with climate change, how do you sell anything to people that don't want to hear about a cost on something? And with Kevin Rudd, of course, he had people on his side. What did he need to do?
Well, he needed to do a large number of things that he didn't do, but one of the first things that he needed to do was communicate. And as you said before, he was swept to power with enormous momentum to act on climate change. In 2006, 2007, Australian voters wanted action on climate change. The election in November 2007 was regarded by many people here and elsewhere in the world as the world's first climate change election. What Australian voters wanted was very clear, but what they needed was also clear, and that was some understanding of what would be required to bring this about. His failure to communicate, which became more and more severe through 2008, 2009, in particular when the global financial crisis did hit, destroyed his ability to maintain the momentum for action. And that had a drastic impact, because as voters started to drift away and their sense of urgency for action began to dissipate, that meant that the forces opposed to climate change action were able to assert themselves without as much fear of electoral backlash, and they grasped the opportunity that they saw occurring when they saw people drifting off. They knew then that they could win this argument because people were just not passionately attached enough to action anymore.
You write in the book that Kyoto was the high point, which of course was symbolic largely, and that a really significant sort of collapse in Kevin Rudd's ability to make decisions and deal with climate change policy happened after the complete schmozzle of Copenhagen. It's a sorry tale reading what you have to write about Kevin Rudd in this book. I mean, everybody, with the exception of Combe, I think, gets a roasting to some degree, but by far Kevin Rudd is the most responsible. Is that a fair reading?
I think that's a fair reading, yes.
You write almost that it was a sort of some kind of a mental collapse that he had about making decisions. What paralysed him?
Kevin Rudd, well, let me start the answer to that question another way. Copenhagen, as people here will no doubt remember, was an absolutely massive event. But it wasn't just massive, it was completely chaotic. So if you think back to the television news at the time in December 2009, it was honestly difficult to know at what point you stopped crying when you saw what was going on over there. The prospects of getting serious decisions out of that shambles was non-existent. any person with any reasonable understanding of the way in which decisions are made at large conferences could not have expected an outcome. Kevin Rudd not only expected an outcome, he expected that he could influence the outcome, create the outcome, and that the outcome would be so positive he'd be borne aloft in triumph and brought back to Australia as the leader who had saved the world. And that was his ambition, and that's what he believed, had he been in control of that conference, he could have achieved. When that didn't occur, when in particular perhaps China, certainly that was the country that he blamed, David Ma uncovered that immortal phrase, which I won't repeat here, but probably everybody knows what I'm talking about. That was, in a sense, that phrase, the use of that phrase in amongst a group of journalists in Copenhagen at the end of that conference, inevitably it was going to get out. And that indicated to me at the time.
I should just check that people do you. Okay, so Kevin Rudd, it was rat fuckers, wasn't it?
Those rat
right?
fuckers have rat fucked us, yes, was what he said.
And it was a remarkable thing to say.
He was referring to the Chinese government, and I must say, as I thought at the time, it might have been better if he said it in Mandarin.
I bet he knows how to.
So I felt, without understanding, I wasn't there. Without understanding exactly what had happened, I felt that something drastic had happened to cause an outburst of that kind. And sure enough, what people noticed when he came back from Copenhagen before Christmas in December 2009 was that he had had some kind of emotional breakdown. He was unable to make decisions about anything at all, and certainly not about climate change policy, which, if you recall at that stage, Abbott was by now leader, having been made leader a few weeks before on the 1st of December 2009, and it was defeated. The CPRS, what a name, you would have to say, that says something in itself, was defeated in the Senate for the second time on the 2nd of December 2009. And this opened up the opportunity when Rudd came back from Copenhagen prior to Christmas for him to take that to a double dissolution election, and all the advice was in the meetings that were held before Christmas that year that they would win that double dissolution election. Had they done that, we would now have that policy.
Several things I want to talk to you in the answer you've just given. One is the name, what's in a name, and it's right through the book is the problem of language in this CPRS. I have never understood why they just didn't call it a price on pollution from the start. Be very clear about what it was. Julia Gillard is quite frank on this point, that the language around the policy from start to finish really made it very, very difficult. How big a part of the problem was it?
Well, it's inconceivable, in my view, that people would understand what carbon pollution reduction scheme meant. When I talked before about the desirability of communicating with voters, perhaps an old-fashioned concept, certainly in the Labor Party, you do not communicate with them, by sitting there for a week, banging your head on the desk and thinking up the most obscure name that you can possibly apply to what is basically forcing polluters to pay for their mess. And so the summary that you just provided, I think, it would be the obvious thing to say. But instead they felt the need to make it obscure and difficult to understand. The Gillard government came up with a much better name later, the Clean Energy Future Package. So I think that language does play an important role in this, in both governments, really. There were very, very profound differences between those two governments. Absolutely profound differences between the two Prime Ministers. But they had one fatal flaw that they shared, and that was an inability to communicate on the same wavelength as voters. And I think that, again, there was a difference beyond that. Nobody ever accused Gillard of hubris, but a charge levelled commonly against Rudd. She wanted to communicate, but there were critical moments where she did not prioritise it, and it ultimately cost her everything.
You mentioned Tony Abbott in December 2009 winning the Liberal leadership by one vote, and I am somebody that always wondered what would have happened if actually Malcolm Turnbull had got all his people in that day, in which case he would have won. There were two missing. Now, you make a really interesting point that by that stage it was lost, that Kevin Rudd, he wanted it both ways. He wanted an opposition leader that would be sympathetic and support this policy, but at the same time he wanted to berate Malcolm Turnbull and deride the Liberal Party. He didn't take them along either. It was a great illustration of a lack of working together, something that our politicians, our political culture doesn't seem to allow anymore. But why was it all over by then? If Malcolm Turnbull had won that vote, why do you think it was too late?
Because by that stage, climate change scepticism had overwhelmed the Liberal Party, and certainly the National Party. So beginning in the regions, which means that Rudd didn't notice it because he didn't notice what went on in the regions. If it wasn't on the front page of the Australian, he didn't care. Beginning in the regions, climate change scepticism within the Liberal Party, which was always a serious threat, caught on like a fire and swept through the party. And so by August, September 2009, the party had basically given itself over to climate change scepticism, and Turnbull would be absolutely unable to withstand that pressure. And even had he won that ballot in December, it's inconceivable to me that his opponents would have just stopped there and said, oh, OK, Malcolm, you won that, all right, well, you do what you'd like to do. They were absolutely intent on destroying him and on destroying that policy, and they would never have stopped.
All right, the other group that, and this perhaps more than anything was an explanation or information that I wanted, was the involvement of the Greens. Because I always thought they got off very, very lightly. That you have a government that's one power, that's broadly on your side. Certainly now it's what it looks like. They wanted a tax on carbon or some sort of payment. The Greens twice voted it down because it wasn't enough. It didn't go far enough. There were too many concessions to the generators of power, and all sorts of other things that they didn't accept. They've now ended up with Tony Abbott. If they'd allowed it to go through, things would have been different. Tell us about the two different schemes. Which was greener in the end? Was it worth it for the Greens to knock it down twice and then have a go with Julia Gillard's policy?
My view is that the Greens made a mistake which will live in history. In December 2009, if you think back, two members of the Liberal Party crossed the floor in the Senate on the 2nd of December 2009.
Judith Troth and
Sue Boyce, yeah. And had the Greens joined with the Labor Party and those two Liberals in the Senate on that day, that policy would have been passed. So they made the decision to sit side by side with the climate change sceptics in the Liberal Party on the other side of the chamber and vote with them to vote the legislation down. That was a very serious decision for them. Now, I'm not saying there are elements of their decision that I can understand, and perhaps we could follow that up at some point if you'd like to, but it's not. This was not a simple decision, and I'm not claiming it was. However, at the end of the day, they had the opportunity to get carbon pricing installed in law in this country, or they had the opportunity to stop that, and they chose to stop it. I evaluated that decision very carefully in the research for the book. I really wanted to make a determination on the basis of an honest appraisal as to whether or not they made the right decision or the wrong decision by denying this country carbon pricing in December 2009. And I came to the decision after a lot of thought and weighing up a lot of evidence and looking at what they did afterwards in 2011 when they were working with Gillard, and came to the conclusion that they had made a terrible decision, which has cost this country dearly and which has led to a situation which we're almost certain to see in July. After 6 years of effort, we'll have nothing. So I think that it is very hard to justify that decision. Now, I interviewed Christine Milne for this, and she said to me that the Gillard package was 1,000 times better, but of course she would. She has to. They have to say that the CPRS was rubbish because they voted against it. They stopped it becoming law. And the difference between the two packages is not that significant, firstly. But secondly, the two reasons that they principally gave for voting against it, which were that the 5% target reduction was inadequate, one, and two, that the compensation to generators was too generous, two, were actually carried through. In fact, the compensation was greater in the Gillard package. So they got trade-offs for that. They got the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, they got a few other things. There was a bit of horse trading. But the two issues that caused them to put up their hands and vote beside the sceptics remained in the second package, in the Gillard package. And in one case, compensation to industry was greater.
If it had got through the first time or even the second time, I mean, my sense of things is that, well, we don't know what would have happened. Kevin Rudd could well have stayed Prime Minister.
You would think so, you would, yeah.
And there would have been some of the lived experience that Julia Gillard really pinned her hopes on, that once she got her proposal, just live with it for a year and you'll see that it's not going to ruin your world. Do you think, I mean, I know there's a lot of hypotheticals in this, but if the Greens have passed it in the Senate, is it the kind of policy that could remain intact now in Australian culture when you have a change of government? How do you actually get a policy nowadays to stay for good? How do you do anything big with the kind of differences that we have?
Well, that question really does go right to the heart of Australian political culture, and it's a big question. And but I think firstly, I'd like to say that I think that had it got through in December 2009, none of the catastrophes that regularly visited us after that in 2010 would have occurred. Obviously, they wouldn't have occurred because that lay at the heart of them. And so Rudd would almost certainly have won the 2010 election. It would be impossible to imagine that he would have lost that election. And therefore, by the time they got to 2013, who knows what would have happened then, but let's say they lost then, Rudd would have still been Prime Minister, and carbon pricing would have been embedded in the Australian economy and in Australia's political culture and psyche ever since 2009, 4 years. It's pretty inconceivable that they could abolish it after 4 years. It would have become entwined in the economy. There would have been... It's impossible to imagine that corporate Australia would have wanted it undone at that point.
It's one of the things about reading this book that the whole sorry saga from beginning to end is that you realise the ramifications that it's had on our broader... I mean, the sort of casualties, just the casualties along the way, but also how you now attempt to reform anything. One of the other really distinctive threads in this story, and I've got a quote here from Ross Garnaut, is about the corporate pressures that were put on government, which I think there's always been some of that, but it seems to have increased so much in recent years. Ross Garnaut said he, I'm quoting, was dismayed by the opaqueness of the corporate pressure on ministers and the government. And this again ties in with our more recent political culture, where if big corporations like miners or trade unions, or in this case electricity generators, don't like policy, they seem to be able to shut it down. How has this come about? What errors were made in the policy decisions that allowed Ross Garnaut to make such a comment?
Well, Garnaut was a central figure in, as we all know, no doubt, in the period 2008-9, and then reappointed by the Gillard government on the insistence of the two independents, Windsor and Oakeshott, in 2011. And I think that basically what happened there was that Garnaut was sidelined by Wong and Rudd from February 2008. So imagine this. The election was November 2007. He'd already been appointed an advisor when they were in opposition. They were, if you think back, all of the states at that time were Labor states. It was an accident, gave them a good opportunity though. And when Rudd took over, the entire country was red. And so they appointed Garnaut when they were in opposition. He originally worked with the secretariat appointed by the then Bracks government in Victoria. But by February, that is 3 months after the election, he had upset the generators so much by saying he didn't believe they should get any compensation at all, that they sidled their way into behind the closed doors of government and effectively got him sidelined. And there were a number of indications of that having happened, but it definitely happened. So a person with an enormous amount of expertise who did an enormous amount of work was effectively frozen out of the process.
And I think unlike the Prime Minister and Penny Wong actually fronted up to the Yarra Valleys, was he one of the very few who actually did front up?
One of the ways in which I try to emphasise how destructive the silence was that I was referring to before, the extraordinary lack of communication, unwillingness to bring voters, or inability to bring voters along on the journey, if you like, was in a case study that I do in which I look at the Latrobe Valley. And the Latrobe Valley, which uses the dirtiest fossil fuel in the world to generate 90% of Victoria's electricity, would be the place in Australia that would be hardest hit by carbon pricing. And dozens of consultants' reports had said that to them. In addition to that, their principal employer, the brown coal generators, were going completely ballistic and saying there will be blackouts, inevitable blackouts. The country will grind to a halt if this happens. And they were terrified. As a community, they were terrified. They believed that the sky was falling in, or about to fall in, and they particularly felt that because despite desperate efforts by large numbers of different groups in that community, they tried to get Rudd or Wong to visit them to explain what was going on, and the politicians refused to come down. In April 2011, when Gillard was Prime Minister, the first person with any association with Canberra and national policy making to come down was Ross Garnaut. who came down, spent 3 hours one night talking to 35 people gathered around a table in Morwell in the town hall or the Shire offices, answered their questions patiently and honestly. And finally, they started to get some understanding of what Canberra policy making might mean. Didn't mean they were any less frightened. There was plenty to be frightened about. But at least he had the courage to go down and talk to them. And that should come from, effectively, if you like, an academic advisor rather than a minister or a prime minister, was a pretty sorry thing to see. I was there on a number of occasions when he came down and observed his performance, and it was a very courageous performance. And because these people were angry, upset and frightened. And eventually the floodgates did open. Gillard was a better communicator. She went down eventually. Combay went down eventually. Simon Crean went down 6 times in a year eventually. But it took a long time to get there.
There's a quote in the book by a Tasmanian academic, Bruce Tranter, and he says that climate change provokes such visceral arguments because it allows ancient battles about personal responsibility, state intervention, the regulation of industry, the distribution of resources and wealth, or the role of technologies in society to be fought all over again. I thought that was a really interesting observation, and there's something in it, isn't there, about those ancient battles. If it's true, how do you think, is there a path ahead? Does it even exist for Australia to have another go at this at some stage in the future?
Yes, I think so. Look, at the end of the day, having almost exhausted myself with gloom as I worked through the terrible mistakes that were made throughout this period of 6 years, which left us in this absurd position that nobody could have foreseen, where so much effort, so much political capital, so many political careers were spent on the rock of climate change action over 6 years. I still came to the end of it thinking, well, there are lessons that we can learn from this. And when momentum begins to pick up again, what I hoped was that the effort that I had gone to try and distill those lessons may be useful to people. And there are some very clear lessons about political strategy and the way in which political strategy needs to be developed to counter a problem like this, to address it, to counter the vested interests that will stand in the way of reform, to attempt to build and cherish consensus where it exists rather than squander it. There are ways in which you can overcome those problems if you foresee them. And part of the issue that occurred, particularly with Kevin Rudd, was that despite the fact, for example, just to give you one example, books had been written at that stage on climate change scepticism in the Liberal Party, books, good books. You did not have to be a genius to know that there was a battle looming between climate change sceptics in the Liberal Party and those who believed in climate change action. And he behaved as though he had the whole thing sewn up, that those who supported action, because they had gone to the election in 2007 supporting action, that they would thereafter continue to adopt that view, and he could, kick the living daylights out of them for years in the Parliament. But when he turned on the money tap and said, OK, time for us to get serious now, they'd fall in behind him. Well, of course, he half murdered the moderate elements of the Liberal Party, and by the time he turned on the money tap and said, OK guys, let's get serious now, Copenhagen's coming up, I want to get it through, it was too late, and they overran Malcolm Turnbull and others in the party. But you would not have to have done too much research to know that that was a quite conceivable outcome of this.
That word you used too about cherishing consensus with the public, that nothing will last forever if it's not looked after.
That's absolutely right.
Except perhaps wrath.
Yeah, that's right. That only gets worse. That's right, and he failed to recognise that it was brittle, and it was brittle. He needed to nurture it, and instead he took the opportunity to do everything he could to undermine Turnbull in the face of Turnbull's troops. And he did. It was a very successful campaign. And one of the things that people may be interested in is that on the day, on 1 September 2009, when Abbott defeated Turnbull, Rudd was ecstatic. He believed that this was exactly the result that was required because, Turnbull had a bit of cachet in the Australian community, and Abbott was regarded as, a right-wing nutcase. And so all of his efforts had come to fruition that day. I have to say that within 3 weeks he was so scared of Abbott, 3 weeks, 2 of which he was out of the country. Within 3 weeks he was so scared of Abbott he refused to go to an election to defend his climate change policy. Another
great moment of making the wrong decision. What happened? The triggers were there. They were there for a January double dissolution.
They were. Before Christmas in 2009, there was a meeting of all of the principal players within the government. Rudd had just got back from Copenhagen. Principal players within the government and within the Labor Party organisation. And agreement was reached at that meeting that there would be an election called when Rudd came back from holidays on Australia Day 2010. But Rudd never had any intention of calling that election. Rudd went into surrender mode immediately on his return from Copenhagen, and there is abundant evidence that I present in the book to back up that assertion, including documentation along with interviews by people who were there. One staff member said to me, the meeting before Christmas was a meeting at which it was agreed there would be an election. And we went off and we started to develop, there were a group of ministerial advisors, and we started to develop policy for the election campaign. And in the end, after a few weeks of really solid work, we came up with a 50-page document. But even though we came up with it in mid-January, we knew that nothing was going to happen. And the reason we knew was because Rudd wasn't there. There was no sprint to the starting line, which you need from a leader in a situation like that. He said to me, we didn't really feel that we had the rug pulled out from under us because we never actually felt we were standing on the rug in the first place. And when you look at it now, with an historian's eye, if you like, it is very clear that Rudd had no intention of calling an election. Rudd wanted to do something else. Rudd was fixated on hospitals policy. And he believed that if he could develop a policy which he could put to a referendum in conjunction with the 2010 election later in the year in 2010, the referendum might get beaten because they usually do, but the focus would be on hospitals so seriously in that campaign that it would get them over the line, that they would win that election. So he never actually wanted to pursue climate change policy, even from December. What he wanted to do was create hospitals policy and come to some decisions about the holding of a referendum in conjunction with the next election. There are other ways in which it became clear to me when I obtained various documents from inside Rudd's office at that time that he had basically given up on climate change. Now, I've got to say this about what I discovered about Rudd's demeanour in that period. He was paralysed, he couldn't make a decision, he was agitated, angry, he did bizarre things, he froze in meetings, he was emotionally overwhelmed by what he was being faced with. All of that is true. But it was worse than that, actually. It was worse because climate change policy, you used the word before, was his signature policy. And he abandoned it. He said he didn't, and he still says he didn't, but he abandoned it. And political courage is an important thing. And one of the big differences between Gillard and Rudd was that she had it and he didn't. And I think that it's very, very difficult, even for those who feel some sympathy for the difficult decisions that Rudd faced at that time, to forgive him for that lack of courage. He was our Prime Minister. He was the one who created that momentum for change in 2006 and 2007, and then who lacked the courage and walked straight away from it immediately. It started to get a bit tough, and Abbott started talking about great big new taxes. So I think you have to be a big person to forgive him for that. And there aren't too many people inside the Labor Party that forgive him for that. And if you look at how an entire country virtually fell silent in April 2010, when it leaked in the Sydney Morning Herald that they had abandoned that policy, you would have to say not too many people in the community forgave him for that either. The Australian public moved on because by that stage it wasn't the most important policy for them, and they were willing to re-embrace him as a leader as time went on and as he undermined Gillard. But if climate change continued to be regarded as an important issue by you, very difficult to imagine you would get a better result if Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister again.
It's a devastating account. I'm somebody that actually worked with Kevin Rudd. I commissioned the Bonhoeffer essay from him, which I think was the first time he used the great moral challenge. I think that's where it first came from. And later other essays. His final one was on the global financial crisis. And so I'm somebody that I enjoyed working with him. I really did. And, you know, for years since, I've heard these stories, people that I know and trust, so many people that I know and trust, give a variation much closer to yours. And it's been a confusing thing. An editor-writer relationship is a very particular one. And I think perhaps I was fortunate that that was the working relationship that I had. Your account, I find the most bruisingly convincing, that somehow looking at a single policy is more revealing in that detail and more upsetting.
Well, one of the things, yes, I hope that's true. It's one of the things I was hoping to achieve. I did feel, I mean, I can't disguise the fact that I have a particular interest and attachment to climate change policy. I think it's incredible, really, that we can just completely ignore, you know, evidence which is as plain as the nose on your face of what's going on. But, you know, somehow we've got to this stage. But I also felt, so I wanted to trace what went wrong. I wanted to understand what the successes and failures were through that 6-year period. But I also did feel that it would give me an insight into the nature of leadership and into the nature of the modern Labor Party and into whether there was any real significance to be attached to the fact that Gillard and Rudd were different types of leaders.
Just quickly, Philip, this idea that now we can have a government with a leader that has said climate change is crap, that to me is, on the science as I know it and as I respect it, the equivalent of the health minister or somebody getting up and saying, drink your urine if you want to cure cancer. You know, that to ignore science, we either respect science or we don't. How has that happened? How were the sceptics able to run away with it to the point where even, you know, at the ABC, for example, and other places, there is such a quest for balance? I'm not a staff member of the ABC, so I can say I don't understand why. I don't understand why we're not balanced about crackpots with medicine and science. Why do you have to be balanced about this? Why has this one subject got such special rights?
Well, when you talk about the ABC, let me just refresh your memory about a particular story. So the period of time that we've been talking about as being pivotal in the Rudd era, late 2009, early 2010. If you think back to that period, there was a 3-week visit in early 2010 from the celebrity climate change denier from the UK, Christopher Monckton. So many people will remember that bizarre behaviour in that 3-week visit, let alone the extraordinarily over-egged CV that he tried to ram down our throats as being real. You know, he'd cured AIDS, he'd cured Graves' disease, he'd had doctorates from everywhere, and I mean, honestly, when I was trained as a journalist, you wouldn't let those people anywhere near a newspaper, and you were trained that people who were mad were not entitled to get in, you know.
Now you kind of got to be, don't you?
And so there are plenty of mad people, and you kept them out every day. But he was on the scale of madness. He was up there, and so just let's think back. The ABC gave him an absolutely tremendous run in that 3-week period in early 2010. They were intimidated into that by those forces in other parts of the media who were watching them very closely, ever ready with allegations of taxpayer-funded bias, and the ABC caved into that pressure. That's one of the things that happened. So they gave him a legitimacy, which he wouldn't have had otherwise. But what gave him the most legitimacy was that Rudd and Wong never said a thing about it. 3 weeks of it at this crucial period in early 2010, they never said a word. And in the meantime, while they were not saying a word, Abbott invited him to Parliament House, met him in a highly publicised meet and greet, big handshakes. Abbott started to adopt his phrases, started to describe climate change using the same phrases that Monckton used. And no matter how mindless those phrases were, they became part of the political discourse. That's one of the things that's happened. I just say that as an example, but Rudd did not fight them. You know, you would think that when this movement is gathering power like this and becoming taken seriously in mainstream media, including the ABC, if you believe in climate change action, you would feel the need to take them on. But no.
Hi, my name is John Knox. Thank you for your talk this evening. I volunteer for 350.org, and in the policy vacuum that's likely to be coming after July 1, I was wondering what role you see for divestment to fill that vacuum.
Well, I think that the vacuum that's likely to come after July 1 needs to be addressed in a political way. So, forgive me if I'm not answering the question, and ask me a follow-up question if I don't. I think that there are two things happening at the moment. I think the Labor Party is really grappling with how to handle this situation. I think there are forces in the Labor Party who clearly just want to dump the whole thing and move in the opposite direction, having seen the damage that it did to them over a 6-year period. I think equally there are forces who were passionate in support of climate action in that 6-year period. Some of them are still there, a lot left, as Sally pointed out earlier. but some of them are still there, and they are still passionate supporters of action. The Labor Party has to fight this out yet, and it will. Now, call me hopelessly idealistic, and call me a fool if you like, but my view is, at least from this vantage point at this moment, that those who continue to passionately support climate action in the Labor Party will probably win that argument. I do believe this, that they will not lose it in the sense that they will never give up. And so there may be some compromise affected, who knows what, silliness emerges. But I think on the political level, that's where it's going to get fought out. On the other hand, in the government, there is no signs at all of any... The government will harden its view rather than soften its view over the next couple of years. But I do expect those pitched battles, which we haven't seen too much of more recently, to revive.
I used to be a climate change believer, and I sort of have a science background. And then I realised I never say I believe in gravity or I believe that bacteria is related to illness. I accept that. And I'm really wondering whether this whole idea that climate change is something you believe in rather than accept, how that has fed the climate where sceptics can arise. I'm interested in your comment
really
if we rerun it.
I think it is a good question, and again it brings us back to the point that we talked about a little bit earlier about how important language is in these debates, and sometimes single words, like the word tax, for example.
Or promise.
Or promise. Or, dare I say it, liar.
Surprise. Sorry.
Well, that's right.
You've got commitment and aspiration.
So I do feel that that they were forced into using some of those words by the strength of the campaigns that were run against them. I do, and I do agree with you that those are not the strongest words they can use in the face of those campaigns, because inherent in some of those words is a type of surrender to the strength of the campaign. I think that's what you're saying, and I'm agreeing with you.
It's really interesting. It's almost, it turns it into something like faith or God, or doesn't it?
It really is that the term denier rather than using skeptic, because they are denying science. So, comment on that, please.
Well, I made a conscious decision in the writing of the book to use the word skeptic, and the reason that I did that was not because I think denier is a better word. I think it probably is. But I was a bit like Julia Gillard in the use of the word tax. I didn't want a tax on the book to be based on the use of a particular word as against another word. I felt that the book would excite quite a bit of opposition, from people who have a vested interest in opposing my interpretation of events, in particular Kevin Rudd and his supporters, and but others as well who have a stake in this debate. And I felt that I couldn't afford to give them that issue, which is something they really take issue with, as you know. They want to have a fight about that all the time. And that wasn't a fight I felt I needed to have. I needed to have more important fights than that.
Our time is up. It's gone so fast, but I noticed there is a little book selling spot down there in the corner, and it is a really fascinating book on so many fronts. Power failure. It was an incredibly important part of Australian policy, and we needed to know the details, and boy are they in here. I think you've interviewed 71 people. You've interviewed all the key players. Kevin Rudd is the only one who wouldn't go on the record, but he did still speak to you. he backgrounded your book. Everybody else you spoke to at least once, and in many cases more than that. But it does what a policy book should do. It tells us what happened, but it also illuminates our political culture. It is disturbing, but it's really, really important if we're going to find out ways to overcome this nightmare that we're in about how you reform, how you change things in this country. So we're really grateful for you to come to the Fifth Estate and go and get a book, have a chat with Philip. I'm sure he'll autograph it. He's a Logie winner. And please give him a very warm applause.